They say the Arizona Territory in '83 could bake a man's soul right out of his body. It was a land of ghosts and gold where your life was worth less than the water in your canteen. In the forgotten town of Redemption, a place that had long given up on its name, a lonely cowboy named Jedediah Stone walked into a cantina, looking for nothing more than a bottle of cheap whiskey. He was a man haunted by the dead, with a heart as barren as the landscape around him. But what he found that day was a living ghost, an Apache girl, the last of her band, being sold like cattle. In a moment of madness or grace, he bought her. He thought he was buying a servant a shadow to fill his empty home. He was wrong. That night, under a sky full of silent stars, she wouldn't just change his life. She would unravel the lie he'd been living and force him to face the devil who'd already destroyed him once. The sun over the Arizona Territory in August of 1883 was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the souls weary enough to walk it. For Jedediah Stone, the heat was a familiar penance. It cooked the grief into his bones, a constant reminder of the fire that had taken everything. His ranch, nestled in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, was a silent tomb, holding the memories of his wife Sarah and their 6-year-old son Sam. For 2 years, silence had been his only companion, and whiskey his only comfort. He rode his weary roan Dusty into the sorry excuse for a town they called Redemption. It was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached buildings, a general store, a livery, a blacksmith, and the cantina that served as its dark, beating heart. Jed wasn't a man for company, but his supplies were low, and his throat was a desert. The cantina, named the Dusty Angel, was anything but. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale beer sweat and cheap tobacco. It was dim, a welcome relief from the blinding sun. But the darkness was filled with the predatory stares of hard men, miners, drifters, and outlaws hiding from a past that was likely to catch up with them. Jed ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the bartender, a portly man named Gus with a stained apron and a perpetually sour expression. Whiskey Jed rasped his voice, rough from disuse. As Gus slammed a dusty bottle and a smeared glass on the bar, a commotion near the back of the room drew Jed's attention. A man stood on a makeshift stage, a few crates pushed together. He was dressed far too well for this god-forsaken place, in a brocade vest and a clean black coat. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and a silver-tongued smile played on his lips. This was Silas Kane, a man known in the territories as the Vulture. He dealt in anything that could turn a profit, including human lives. "Gentlemen, a rare opportunity for you." Today, Kane's voice oozed a false charm that set Jed's teeth on edge. A true treasure of the vanishing plains. The last of the Mescalero renegades from the Chiricahua skirmish, 2 of Kane's brutish thugs shoved a figure forward into the sliver of light. It was a girl, hardly a woman. She was thin, her frame looking fragile under a simple doeskin dress, but there was nothing fragile in her eyes. They were black, deep-set, and burned with a fire of pure, unadulterated hatred that seemed to scorch every man they landed on. Her hands were bound in front of her, and a long braid of black hair fell over her shoulder. She didn't cry out or struggle. She stood with a rigid dignity that was a stark defiance against her humiliation. A genuine Apache Princess Kane lied with practiced ease, taught all the womanly arts you could desire, strong, healthy, and completely broken in. Who'll start the bidding for this fine piece of property? Shall we say $20? A sick feeling coiled in Jed's gut. He'd seen a lot of ugliness in his life, but this was a sacrilege. The men in the room started to hoot and holler. A grimy miner with yellow teeth yelled, 15-20 from the gentleman in the back." Kane roared, pointing. "Do I hear 25? Jed looked at the girl. Her face was a stony mask, but he saw the faintest tremor in her jaw. In her defiant stare, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own trapped soul. He saw a survivor. For 2 years he had been dead inside a walking ghost. Looking at her standing there against a room full of jackals, he felt the first flicker of something other than grief or rage. It was a hot, protective anger. It was shame. He thought of Sarah. He thought of how she would have looked at these men with a quiet contempt that was more powerful than any weapon. He thought of Sam and the innocence the world had stolen from him. 30, another man shouted. 35, Kane's eyes gleamed. He was playing the crowd like a fiddle. A bargain, gentleman, for a lifetime of service. Jed didn't know what came over him. It wasn't a thought, it was an impulse, raw and undeniable. Before he could stop himself, his voice cut through the din, cold and clear as a winter morning. $100. The cantina fell silent. Every head turned to look at the quiet man at the bar. Gus the bartender froze his hand halfway to wiping the counter. Silas Kane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. $100 was a fortune. It was more than most of these men made in 6 months. It was, as it happened, almost every cent Jed had to his name saved from a small gold claim he'd been working half-heartedly. Kane recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing on Jed. $100 from the quiet stranger. A man of taste and means. Do I hear 110? The room was quiet. The other men grumbled, their fleeting lust turning to resentment. They were out of the game, going once. Kane's eyes scanned the crowd, a showman to the last. Going twice. Jed's heart pounded in his chest. "What are you doing?" a voice screamed in his head. "You're buying a person. You're becoming one of them." But another deeper instinct had taken over. Sold Kane's voice boomed, and he slammed a small gavel on a crate for effect. To the gentleman for $100, Jed pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat and counted out the gold and silver coins onto the bar. His hands were steady, but his insides were churning. Kane's men shoved the girl towards him. They untied her hands, and one of them gave her a final contemptuous push that sent her stumbling forward. She caught her balance and stood before Jed, her chin held high. Her dark eyes met his, and there was no gratitude in them. There was no relief. There was only that same burning fire now directed solely at him. She saw no savior. She saw only a new owner. Jedediah Stone, the lonely cowboy who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his ghosts, had just bought a living one. And as he looked into her unbroken eyes, he had the unnerving feeling that he was the one who had just been captured. The weight of his $100 felt like a millstone around his neck, and the long, silent ride back to his ranch loomed before him like a passage into a new kind of hell. The ride back to Jed's homestead was a journey through a shared, suffocating silence. It was 8 miles of rock and cactus, the sun relentless, the only sound the plodding of Dusty's hooves and the scuff of the girl's worn moccasins in the dirt. Jed had offered her to ride behind him, a gesture he'd made awkwardly, pointing at the back of his saddle. She had simply stared at him, her expression unreadable, and then turned and started walking. He didn't push it. He rode slowly, letting her set the pace, the space between them filled with a tension thicker than the dust they kicked up. He watched her from his saddle. She moved with an economy of motion he'd never seen, before her back straight, her steps sure-footed even on the rocky terrain. She wasn't just walking. She was observing. Her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the rocks, the sparse vegetation. She was reading the land like a book he'd never learned the alphabet for. He was the one with the horse and the gun, but out here he felt like a clumsy intruder in her world. His mind was a maelstrom of regret and confusion. What had he done? He had spent the last of his money on a person, an Apache girl. The people who knew his story, the few who were left, knew that his family had been... He couldn't even form the words. The official report said it was a renegade raid. He had spent 2 years marinating in that hatred, letting it poison what little was left of him. And now the object of that hate was walking behind his horse. They arrived at his ranch as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the mountains in hues of orange and violet. The place was as stark and lonely as Jed's soul. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a corral with a single horse, a well and a small barn, and beyond that, on a small rise overlooking the valley, were 2 simple wooden crosses. He dismounted and led Dusty to the trough. The girl stopped 20 feet from the cabin, her posture wary like a wild animal assessing a trap. "Water, Jed," said his voice, a dry crackle. He gestured toward the well. She watched him, her eyes narrowed. She didn't move. She was thirsty. He could see it in the slight cracking of her lips. But her pride was a fortress. She would not take anything from him. Jed sighed a long, weary breath. He worked the pump, the rusty handle groaning in protest, and filled a dipper. He drank first to show it was safe, then set it down on the edge of the trough, a good distance from her. He turned and began to unsaddle Dusty, giving her space. After a long moment, he heard the soft scrape of the metal dipper. He didn't look back. The cabin was one-room Spartan and grimly functional. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 1 chair, a bed in the corner, and a small cot on the opposite wall. It was a space built for a family, now occupied by the ghost of one. The air was thick with memory. He could still see Sarah humming by the fire, could almost hear Sam's laughter echoing in the rafters. He lit a lantern, casting flickering shadows across the room. When he turned, the girl was standing in the open doorway, a silhouette against the dying light. She hadn't crossed the threshold. Jed felt a fresh wave of unease. He had no plan. He had acted on an instinct he didn't understand, and now the consequences of that act were standing in his doorway, watching him with ancient, accusing eyes. You can sleep there," he said, pointing to the cot. It had been Sam's. The moment he said it, a sharp pain lanced through him. He hadn't allowed himself to touch it in 2 years. She gave no sign of having heard him. Her gaze drifted past him to the small, crudely carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was the last thing he had carved for Sam. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, and for the first time their fiery defensiveness softened, replaced by something unreadable, something that looked almost like recognition. Jed cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "I'll be outside." He took his rifle and a blanket and walked out of the cabin, leaving the lantern lit for her. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe he thought she'd feel safer alone. Maybe it was because he couldn't bear to be in that room with her, with all his ghosts suddenly stirred from their slumber. He sat on the porch steps, the blanket around his shoulders, his rifle across his lap. The desert night grew cold quickly. The sky was a vast, glittering expanse of stars, indifferent and eternal. He was the owner, the man in charge, yet he was the one sleeping outside his own home. He had bought her freedom from Silas Kane, only to put her in a different cage. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. He listened to the sounds of the night, the cry of a distant coyote, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. He listened for any sound from the cabin, but there was only silence. A profound, heavy silence that felt different from the loneliness he was used to. This was the silence of two worlds colliding, of two histories steeped in blood and grief now trapped under a single roof. He felt the $100 not as a purchase price, but as a debt he had no idea how to repay. Jed must have dozed off slumped against a porch post because he was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong to the night. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping. The pre-dawn light was a pale grey wash over the landscape, and the air was sharp with cold. He pushed himself up his back, aching, and saw her. The Apache girl was by the well, using a flat, sharp-edged stone to methodically sharpen a rusted shovel head she must have found near the barn. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was hypnotic patient. She wasn't trying to be quiet. It was a statement. I am not idle. I am not helpless. He watched her for a long moment. In the cool morning light, he could see the details he'd missed in the cantina's gloom. There were faded scars on her arms, thin white lines that spoke of a hard life. Her face, though young, was etched with a deep solemnity. She was a survivor, forged in a crucible of loss he could only begin to imagine. Jed stood up and stretched the motion stiff and loud. Her head snapped up her eyes instantly, alert the stone held in her hand like a weapon. The brief moment of peace was shattered. She was a coiled spring again, ready to fight or flee. Easy, he said, holding his hands up slightly. I'm just making coffee. He went inside. The cabin felt strange, as if its very air had been altered by her presence. The cot was empty, the thin blanket folded with a neatness that felt alien to the room's usual disarray. She hadn't touched anything else. The wooden horse was still on the mantelpiece. He built a fire in the hearth, his movements practiced and automatic. As the smell of coffee began to fill the small space, he realized he didn't know her name. He didn't know a single word of her language. She was a complete unknown. A puzzle he had no pieces for. He took a tin cup of coffee and a piece of hard tack and went back outside. She was gone from the well. His heart leapt into his throat. Had she run? He scanned the area, a ridiculous sense of panic rising in him. Then he saw her. She was at the far edge of his property, near the scrubby patch where Sarah had once tried to grow a garden. She was on her knees, digging in the hard-packed earth with the now sharpened shovel head. He walked over, stopping a respectful distance away. She was unearthing the roots of a yucca plant. He watched, fascinated, as she expertly separated the thick, fleshy roots from the soil. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity that was mesmerizing. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't answer. She ignored him for a time, then she paused, holding up one of the roots. She looked at him directly, then rubbed the root against her dress, mimicking the act of washing. Then she held it to her mouth. Food. Then she pointed to her hair and made a lathering motion. Soap. She was showing him, not teaching, just stating a fact of her world, her knowledge. It was the first attempt at communication, a bridge built of gestures across a chasm of silence and mistrust. A little later, as the sun climbed higher, he was checking the cinch on Dusty's saddle, planning to ride out and check his snares. He felt her eyes on him. He turned. She was standing by the porch, holding out her hand. In her palm were several small, dark berries he'd seen 1,000 times on the bushes dotting the hills, but had always assumed were poison. She saw the hesitation in his eyes. Without breaking eye contact, she put a few of the berries in her own mouth and chewed them slowly, deliberately. She was proving they were safe. More than that, she was offering him something. A gift. A trade. He wasn't sure. He walked over and hesitantly took the berries from her palm. Her skin was cool. He put them in his mouth. They were tart, but surprisingly sweet, a burst of flavor in his world of bland hardtack and jerky. Good, he said, nodding. "Thank you." She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in return. Her eyes then flickered down to his left hand, which was resting on his saddle horn. A long, jagged scar ran from his knuckle to his wrist, a poorly healed reminder of a fight with a mountain lion years ago. She pointed to it. Then she lifted the sleeve of her own dress, revealing a similar, though older and finer scar on her own forearm. She looked from his scar to hers, then back to his eyes. In that moment, the air shifted. It was a profound and startling connection, a communication that transcended words. "I see your wound. I have them, too. We are not so different." It was the language of scars, a testament to the pain and survival that had shaped them both. That night, Jed didn't sleep on the porch. He brought his blanket inside and laid it on the floor by the fire, a good 10 feet from her cot. When he blew out the lantern, the darkness was no longer filled with menace and mistrust. It was still a silence, but it was a different kind. It was a watchful silence, a silence of waiting. He lay there for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. He had bought a person at a devil's auction. He had brought an Apache, a supposed enemy, into the home where his family had been lost to a raid. But the woman sleeping on the cot across the room was not a concept, not an enemy. She was a person of deep knowledge, quiet strength, and scars that mirrored his own. He found himself thinking not of revenge, but of the berries she had given him. He thought of her hands, calloused and capable digging for roots in the earth. That night, something began to change in Jedediah Stone. The hard, frozen ground of his grief, which he had guarded for 2 long years, felt the first tentative touch of a thaw. He wasn't just her captor anymore. He was becoming her student. The days that followed settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm. They were 2 solitary planets, orbiting the same dying star of grief, maintaining a careful distance, while being undeniably bound by the gravity of their shared space. The girl, he still didn't know her name, began to transform the barren patch of land by the cabin. She used her knowledge to find life where Jed had only ever seen desolation. She would return from walks with her hands full of things, edible cacti, more roots, herbs he couldn't name. She set up snares far more clever than his own, catching rabbits, and quail with quiet efficiency. She was turning his desolate homestead, his monument to loss, into a place of survival. Jed found himself watching her learning. He saw how she tracked game, how she read the weather in the clouds, how she could find water by following the flight of certain birds. She never spoke a word to him, but she taught him more about living in this harsh land in 2 weeks than he had learned in 10 years. The hatred he had nurtured for her people, the blind, ignorant rage that had been his companion for so long, began to feel flimsy, shamefully baseless. It was a story he had been told, a story he had told himself. It crumbled in the face of the reality of the person before him. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, he was mending a bridle on the porch when he heard her make a sound. It wasn't a word, but a soft, guttural gasp. He looked up. She was standing by the 2 wooden crosses on the hill, her back to him. She had never gone near them before. Jed's heart seized. That was his sacred ground, his shrine of pain. He stood up a protest forming on his lips, but it died before it was spoken. She wasn't defiling the graves. She had placed a small, simple offering at the base of each cross, a single eagle feather for Sarah's, and a smooth white stone for Sam's. In her culture, these were gestures of respect for the departed spirits. He walked slowly up the hill, his boots crunching on the dry soil. He stopped a few feet behind her. She didn't turn, but he knew she was aware of him. They stood there together, looking at the graves of his wife and son. The chasm between them was still there, but for the first time they were standing on the same side of it. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he pointed to the larger cross. "And Sam, my son." She turned her head slightly, her profile outlined against the vast blue sky. She listened, her dark eyes fixed on the wooden markers. "We were happy here," he found himself saying the words, rusty and painful. "We were building a life." He stopped the rest of the story, a physical blockage in his throat. She turned to face him fully. Her expression was one of deep, knowing sorrow. She lifted a hand and touched her own chest just over her heart. Then she gestured out towards the mountains, the plains, the whole world. Her meaning was devastatingly clear. I had a family too. I lost them too. That night he finally asked. They were sitting by the fire, the silence between them now more comfortable than tense. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She looked at the flames for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, softer than he'd imagined. "Narlin." It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Narlin," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It felt right. The dam of his own silence broke. He started talking, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of grief he had held back for 2 years. He told her about Sarah's laugh and the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. He told her about Sam's obsession with horses and how he had promised to buy him a pony of his own one day. And then he told her about the fire. It wasn't a raid, he confessed, the words tasting like ash, not like the stories they tell. It was white men, outlaws, led by a man with a silver smile and dead eyes. He had been in town getting supplies. When he returned, his world was smoke and embers. The sheriff in Redemption, a tired old man named Brody, had called it an Apache raid. It was easier that way. No one wanted to admit that the real monsters often looked just like them. "They told me it was your people," Jed said, his voice cracking. "I believed them. I wanted to believe them. It was easier to hate a whole tribe than to hunt for ghosts." Narlin listened, her gaze unwavering. When he finished his confession, hanging in the air between them like smoke, she spoke her second word to him. She pointed to the wooden horse on the mantel, the one Sam had loved. "Shiji," she whispered. It was an Apache word. "What does that mean?" Jed asked. "My brother," she said, her English halting but clear. She then pointed to herself, and then to the vast, empty darkness outside the cabin door. All gone. The weight of her loss, so simply stated, crushed him. He had been so consumed by his own tragedy that he had never truly considered the depth of hers. She was the last of her band, a living testament to a massacre. The men who had killed her family were likely the same kind of men who had killed his. They were both survivors of the same brutal, lawless greed that infected this land. He finally understood. The $100 he had paid was not a purchase. It was a panicked, desperate act of seeing himself in another's eyes. He had not saved her that day in the cantina. He had saved a piece of his own humanity. He looked at Narlin, no longer seeing an Apache or a captive, but a fellow traveler in the land of the dead. He had bought her, yes, but she was the one who was setting him free, free from his lies, free from his blind hatred, and free from the suffocating loneliness that had been his prison. The ghosts of Sarah and Sam were still there, but for the first time he felt he could share the space with them without being consumed. He was no longer alone in his haunting. A fragile peace settled over the small ranch in the weeks that followed. It was a peace born not of comfort, but of mutual understanding. Jed and Narlin worked together, their communication, a sparse blend of English Apache words and the silent language of shared tasks. He taught her how to use and clean his rifle. She taught him which plants could be used for medicine and which for poison. They fortified the small cabin, reinforcing the door and shuttering the windows, not out of any specific fear, but from a shared instinct that the world was a dangerous place. One morning, Jed rode into Redemption for the first time since the auction. He needed salt flour and coffee. He left Narlin at the ranch, a decision that filled him with a low-grade anxiety. He left his spare pistol, with her a gesture of trust she accepted, with a solemn nod. The moment he entered the Dusty Angel, he knew something was wrong. The usual low murmur of conversation ceased. All eyes turned to him. Gus the bartender gave him a look that was a mixture of fear and pity. Stone, a voice drawled from a corner table. Jed turned. It was Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture seemed permanently shaped by the weight of his tin star. With him were two men Jed recognized with a jolt, the thugs who worked for Silas Kane. Sheriff Jed said, his voice flat. "Been meaning to ride out and see you," Brody said, not getting up. "Heard some interesting things. Silas Kane here filed a complaint. Says you stole his property." Jed's hand instinctively drifted closer to the Colt on his hip. "I paid for what I bought, Brody. Fair and square in your town's finest establishment." One of Kane's men, a hulking brute with a scarred face, laughed. "He thinks a piece of paper makes him a gentleman." "Where is she?" Stone Sheriff Brody asked, his voice tired. "Kane wants her back. He's willing to return your money, causing a lot of trouble over it." "She's not a stray horse you can just reclaim." Sheriff Jed said, his voice dangerously low. The deal was done. Suddenly the cantina doors swung open and Silas Kane himself strode in. He was smiling that same oily reptilian smile. He looked Jed up and down with open contempt. "Jedediah Stone Kane," said, his voice filling the room. "The grieving recluse. I must say I'm surprised. I never took you for a man with a taste for exotic pets. But I'm a reasonable man. I've had a better offer for the girl. A certain major in the U.S. Cavalry has a particular interest in collecting such artifacts. He's willing to pay $300. So I'll give you your $100 back plus another $20 for your trouble, and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding." The casual way he spoke of Narlin, the way he reduced her to an artifact, sent a hot spike of rage through Jed's chest. This wasn't about money. For Kane, this was about power and humiliation. He couldn't stand that a broken-down rancher like Jed had defied him. "She's not for sale," Jed said, his gaze locked on Kane. Kane's smile tightened. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Stone. You of all people should know that. Now Sheriff Brody is here to ensure this transaction goes smoothly. Just tell us where she is." Jed looked at Brody. He saw the conflict in the old sheriff's eyes. Brody was a man who followed the path of least resistance, and Silas Kane created a lot of resistance. The law in a place like Redemption was a flimsy thing easily bent by money and influence. "I won't tell you," Jed said. Kane sighed dramatically. "I had hoped to avoid unpleasantness." He nodded to his men. The two thugs stood up, their hands going to their guns. The other patrons in the cantina either ducked their heads or backed away, wanting no part of the coming storm. "Now hold on, Brody," said, finally rising to his feet. "This is a civil matter, Silas. It stopped being civil when he stole my merchandise," Sheriff Kane sneered. "You can either be a witness or a casualty. Your choice." Jed knew he couldn't fight all three of them in here. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to get back to Nayland. He met Kane's eyes, and in their cold depths he saw a flicker of something familiar. A predatory glee. It was the same look he'd imagined in the eyes of the men who had destroyed his home. Without another word, Jed turned and walked out of the cantina. He didn't run. He walked with a deliberate calmness. He did not feel every nerve screaming in anticipation of a bullet in his back. He reached Dusty, unhitched the reins, and swung into the saddle. He could feel their eyes on him from the doorway. He spurred Dusty into a gallop, not looking back, the dust of Redemption's lonely street billowing behind him. He hadn't resolved anything. He had only delayed the inevitable. The vulture's shadow was falling over his land, and this time it wasn't just his own life he had to protect. The fragile peace was over. The war was coming to his doorstep. The ride back was a frantic, desperate race against time. Jed pushed Dusty harder than he ever had his mind churning. Cain wouldn't wait for the law. He would come, and he would come with force. When he galloped into the clearing, he saw Nalin standing outside the cabin, the pistol held loosely, but ready at her side. She had heard him coming from a mile away. Her eyes locked on his, and she knew instantly. She didn't need words to read the terror and urgency on his face. "Cain," he gasped as he slid from the saddle. "He's coming!" She nodded once, her expression hardening into a warrior's mask. In that moment, any remaining trace of the victim he'd seen on the auction block was gone forever. She was a fighter, and this was her territory now too. They worked with a frantic, silent synergy. Jed barred the cabin door and windows, checking his rifle and ammunition. Nalin disappeared into the rocks behind the cabin, her movements swift and silent as a phantom. She returned minutes later, her hands filled with something. She began crushing dried plants and mixing them with a sticky resin from a pinyon pine. "What is that?" he asked. "Chilbilatadere," she said, not looking up. "Sagebrush. For the smoke, it blinds the eyes, makes them choke." She was preparing for a siege. Her ancestors had been fighting this kind of battle for centuries. While he was thinking about walls and bullets, she was thinking about the land itself as a weapon. The sun was beginning to set when they heard the horses, 3 riders silhouetted against the crimson sky, Cain and his 2 thugs. They reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, just beyond rifle range. Stone Cain's voice echoed in the twilight. "You have made a grave error in judgment. Send out the girl, and I'll let you live out your miserable existence in this hovel. Refuse, and I will burn it to the ground, with you inside it." Jed raised his rifle to the window slit. "You step 1 foot closer, Cain, and I'll send you to hell." A gunshot cracked the air, and a bullet splintered the wood next to Jed's face. He ducked back, his heart hammering. The siege began. The first assault was direct. The 2 thugs, Cletus and Boone, charged forward on foot, firing their pistols at the cabin. Jed returned fire, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. He drove them back into the cover of the rocks, but they were testing him, probing his defenses. As darkness fell, the real battle started. It was a game of cat and mouse. Nalin slipped out the back of the cabin, a knife between her teeth, and vanished into the night. Jed's blood ran cold. He was alone. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of her, any sound of a struggle. All he heard was the wind and the taunts of Cain's men. Then a scream tore through the night from the east side of the clearing. It was Boone. Jed risked a look. The man was stumbling around, clutching at his eyes. Nalin had set one of her smoke traps, a bundle of the burning herbs thrown from the darkness, catching him completely by surprise. Cletus ran to help him, and in that moment of distraction, Jed fired. Cletus cried out, and fell, clutching a wounded leg. 1 down, 1 blinded. But Cain was still out there. Clever little savage Cain roared from the darkness, his voice laced with fury. "You can't hide forever." Suddenly gunfire erupted from a new position, from the rocks above and to the left of the cabin. Cain had circled around. A bullet ripped through the cabin wall, shattering a tin plate on the shelf. Jed dove to the floor. Cain had him pinned. He heard a soft sound behind him and spun around, rifle raised. It was Naylan, slipping back inside her face, grim. She held up 3 fingers, then made a cutting motion across her throat for one and pointed to her own leg for the second. Boone was dead. His throat slit in the confusion. Cletus was wounded, but still a threat. That left Cain. "He's up in the rocks," Jed whispered. "He's got me pinned." Narlin's eyes surveyed the room. They landed on the fireplace. A desperate, brilliant idea sparked in her gaze. She pointed to the fireplace, then to the sacks of flour in the corner. Jed didn't understand. She grabbed a handful of flour, tossed it into the fire's embers, and a brilliant whoosh of flame erupted, a small, contained explosion. She looked at him, her eyes wide with urgency. He understood. A dust explosion. It was their only chance. It was insane. "Draw his fire," she whispered, her hand on his arm. Jed took a deep breath, crawled to the window, and fired 2 shots toward Cain's position. As expected, Cain returned fire immediately, the bullets thudding into the log walls. That was the signal. While Jed kept Cain occupied, Narlin worked with lightning speed. She tore open 2 sacks of flour and with a blanket began to whip the fine powder into the air inside the cabin, creating a thick white combustible cloud. She then grabbed the lit lantern, smashed the glass, and held the open flame. Now she screamed. Jed scrambled away from the window as Narlin hurled the flaming lantern into the heart of the flour-filled room. The world erupted in a deafening roar of fire and force. The roof of the cabin lifted, and the front wall blew outward in a wave of incandescent fury. The force of the blast threw Jed against the back wall, his head cracking against the logs. He came to dazed his ears, ringing the smell of burnt flour and scorched wood filling his lungs. The cabin was a wreck open to the night sky. Narlin was helping him up her face, smudged with soot. And in the clearing, illuminated by the burning remnants of the cabin, stood Silas Cain. He was staggering, his fine coat in tatters, a look of disbelief on his face. The explosion had caught him as he was advancing on the cabin. He saw Jed and Narlin rise from the wreckage, and his disbelief turned to pure, murderous rage. He raised his pistol. At that same moment, Jed's dazed eyes focused on something glinting on Cain's vest. It was a small silver locket hanging from his watch chain. A locket with a familiar single rose engraving. Sarah's locket, the one he'd given her, the one that had been missing from her body. The truth hit Jedediah Stone with the force of a physical blow more powerful than the explosion. The raid, the lies, the ghosts. It was never Apaches. It was him. It had always been him. Silas Cain, the vulture, hadn't just sold Narlin. He had murdered his family. Jed breathed a single word filled with 2 years of agony. An unholy scream of pure primal rage tore from Jed's throat. He didn't reach for his gun. He launched himself out of the burning cabin, a man with nothing left to lose, charging the devil who had taken his world. He slammed into Cain, and the 2 men went down in a desperate, brutal struggle in the dirt lit by the flames of Jed's burning past. The fight was not one of skill, but of pure, unrestrained fury. Jed was a man possessed his fists, striking Cain with all the force of his grief and rage. Cain, for all his swagger, was a predator who relied on fear, not a brawler. He was unprepared for the raw savagery of a man confronting his family's murderer. Jed saw Sarah's face in the flames. He heard Sam's laughter in the ringing of his own ears. He wrestled Cain's pistol from his hand and brought the butt of it down hard. Once. Twice. The fight went out of Silas Cain, leaving him a broken, bleeding mess in the dirt. Jed stood over him, panting the pistol in his hand, every fiber of his being screaming for him to pull the trigger and end it, to send this monster to the hell he so richly deserved. He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jedediah. Narlin's voice cut through his bloodlust. It was calm, steady. He turned to look at her. She was standing by the ruins of the cabin, her face illuminated by the fire. She simply shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Her eyes weren't pleading. They were knowing. They held a mirror up to his soul. Don't become him. The rage receded, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. Killing Cain now would be an execution, not a battle. It wouldn't bring Sarah and Sam back. It would only kill what little was left of Jedediah Stone. He let the gun fall from his hand. The sound of approaching horses made them both turn. A posse. Riding at the head was Sheriff Brody. He must have had a pang of conscience, or perhaps just a desire to avoid the paperwork of a massacre. Brody took in the scene, the burning cabin, the dead man, the wounded one, and the broken form of Silas Cain. He saw the pistol lying in the dirt between Jed and his vanquished foe. He looked at Jed, then at Nalin, who stood unbowed amidst the destruction she had helped create. The sheriff sighed, the sound of a man perpetually exhausted by the world. He dismounted and nudged Cain with his boot. Cain groaned. Silas Cain Brody said, his voice devoid of emotion, "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Cletus Boone and the assault on Jedediah Stone." He then looked at Jed, his eyes lingering on Sarah's locket, which Jed had ripped from Cain's vest. Brody knew the story. He had helped bury the bodies. And I reckon we'll have a long talk about some old business, too. Justice, it turned out, had finally found its way to redemption. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The cabin was a blackened skeleton. The bodies had been taken away. Cain was in chains on his way to a federal judge, and most likely a hangman's noose. Jed and Narlin stood in the morning light, surrounded by the ashes of his old life. Everything he had built was gone. "It's all gone," he said, his voice raspy. "Goju," Narlin said softly. She saw the question in his eyes. "It means beauty, but also balance. Order. Things are now in their right place." She gestured to the ashes. This was a house of ghosts, a house of sorrow. He looked at her, truly seeing the wisdom in her words. She was right. He had been living in a tomb. "You're free, Narlin," he said, the words feeling both momentous and inadequate. Truly free. "I have a friend, Elias Vance, who runs a trading post 2 days north. He can help you get wherever you want to go, to find your people if any are left." He would give her Dusty, his last real possession of value. She listened, her dark eyes searching his face. She looked at the smouldering ruins, then at the 2 graves on the hill, then back to him. "My people are gone," she said, a simple statement of fact, devoid of self-pity. "My home is ash, same as yours." She took a step closer, not towards the trail that led away, but towards the center of the ruined foundation. She picked up a single unburnt stone from the fireplace. "We build a new one," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. A house for the living, not for ghosts. Jedediah Stone looked at the stone in her hand, then at the vast open land around them, bathed in the clean light of a new day. The lonely cowboy who had bought the last Apache girl was gone, burned away in the fire of reckoning. In his place stood a man who had been given a second chance, not to forget his past, but to build a future alongside it. And beside him stood the woman who had not been bought, but who had, with fierce dignity and quiet wisdom, shown him the way out of the darkness. Together they were 2 survivors, 2 builders, and on the ashes of what was lost, they would lay the first stone of a new foundation. The story of Jedediah and Narlin isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a story about how the deepest wounds can begin to heal when we dare to see the humanity in those we're told to hate. It's about how true strength isn't found in revenge, but in the courage to rebuild. They started with nothing but ashes and a shared understanding of loss, but together they found more than just survival. They found redemption. It proves that sometimes the person who changes you forever doesn't come into your life to save you, but to stand with you while you save yourself. If their journey from darkness into light moved you, please help us share more stories like this. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a story with heart, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of the untamed human spirit. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Jed's transformation. Thank you for listening.